Just very briefly, the last talk of today by Eyal Weizman will bring us back in a certain way to the very beginning of the conference, because Eyal's contribution is a response of a kind to Ariela's research on the family of man. He asks the question of what if the resources that are invested in the study of images of the living were invested in those of the dead, what epistemic and political and formal stakes are at hand. And I cannot resist pointing out that there's probably no better place to talk about this than in front of the towering necropolis right behind us. Thank you very much for joining us, Eyal. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Teodad, and thank you for your patience to stay here to now. So this presentation, I have to start with kind of a note. It is going through material, or it includes material, is produced together with Thomas Keenan here, and to a certain extent with Nicholas Hirsch in relation to another project. And having this work include research done with Keenan mean, of course, that everything that you will not like about this presentation obviously comes from him. The proposition we were asked to respond to is about humanism and universalism, human rights and photography. And we had Ariela speaking about Steichen, Family of Man, at the MoMA in 1955. I'd like in this presentation to query Ariela's provocative proposition on the nature of human rights and images by turning our attention to a slightly more grim subject, and that is of the dead. So this perhaps is why I call this presentation The Family of Dead. Gravediggers, and in gravediggers I include a varied group of people that has in it forensic archaeologist, anthropologist, pathologist, dental expert, biodata technicians, DNA specialists, and statisticians of all sorts, people working in an international team organized by NGOs or sponsored by the United Nations or by international tribunals, since the middle of the 1980s and ever increasingly since, upturning the ground in search for kind of clues of war crime violations. From Spain, Guatemala, Poland, Cambodia, Afghanistan, Sudan, Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Honduras, Iraqi Kurdistan, Cyprus, etc., the kind of grave digging becomes one of the most important epistemic resources to enter into histories of violence. Now, this is indeed, this is not to say that exhumation started in the 80s, but to that extent, and to in the context of war crime investigation, that is almost kind of like a clear sort of starting point, and I'll get back to it. Raleigh talked about the universality of death, of course, and a center problematic universality of victims. Are gravediggers at the new universalists? Are all exhumed bodies those of victims? What is universalizing about this work? Of course, one could think of these practitioners mainly as equivalent to pathologists in criminal law, something akin to police officers or police investigators. This is obviously not in any way kind of a profession that has a universalist claim, simply working beyond the border of the state. In their view, however, in the view of the gravediggers, their work is universalizing because they are recreating the history of crimes against humanity, genocide being on the top of this list. For them, no one has better claim on universal humanism or of human right than those who suffered the worst, right? So those who suffer the worst in a context of kind of thinking human rights and thinking that kind of the limit concept of that has obviously been in varied literature, the kind of the Muslim of the camp, and the camp being the site of testimony, in a sense, which is somehow being shifted now from the camp and from that sort of barely alive character of the Muslim to the dead body in the mass grave, from the camp to the grave. But the problem of bones is that in first look, they all look similar. They are devoid of the expression, the action, and the gesture captured by Steichen and unpacked in Ariela's account. The gravediggers has set of prosthetic sensor, though, for which to actually start making sense of that pile of bones that they are uncovering in this mass grave propped up by a retaining wall here, that can differentiate the kind of the finding in relation to gender, race. In fact, one of the last profession that still has kind of race as a category in it is the forensic anthropologist. But also in relation to kind of illnesses or any sort of traits of the person that is now exhumed. Calculated, though, as balances of probability. There's never kind of an image, right, that could communicate a certain sort of obviousness of a wrong, besides the fact that the person is dead, right? That we have balances of probability to do with all sorts of reading of possible events into them. Very technically, there are two main ways of studying the skeleton, and they are often in tension. In fact, they disturb and collide with each other. The first is an analysis of the cause of death. So this is the identification of the terminal moment, poisoning, multiple gunshots to the head, hanging, macheting, all sort of awful things, catalog of like forms of murder that you can think about. And the other is identification. Who is it? Who is that person that is being dug up? This, if the first refers to the moment, or to the moment of transition between life and death, the second refers to the whole kind of process of life as it is registered, as it is turned into the morphology of the bones himself. Right? So we have a kind of a long process that includes in it all sorts of things that I think Ariela was kind of mentioning before. Labor conditions, accidents, migration. The movement from one environment to the other is also something that is registered on the bone and could be read. There is a kind of a geography that is fossilized into those things. So why are they in tension? Whereas the first one, how did you die, usually refers to evidence in international courts, and this is what they need, right, to establish a kind of a pattern of killing, say by the ICTY in connection to Yugoslavia. The kind of the interest of the families is who are you, and that kind of return of the body to the family. The trials of the Argentine junta and the exhumation of the disappeared people during the Argentine dirty wars at the end of the 70s, are referred to by most literature on the emergence of forensic in war crime investigation as the starting point, right? This is when mass exhumations are undertaken and where this question of identification, i.e. that sort of the process in which time process is turning into form, texture, fissures in bones themselves is actually begin. The man who trained the group of forensic anthropologists in Argentina, Clyde Snow, and you see him in that image with his back to us, is a kind of Hamlet-like figure, rarely seen without a skull, rarely seen not posing questions to skull. He called his work on identifying human remain osteobiography. Osteobiography. That is, of course, the biography of bones. By referring to biography, there is a more than the moment of death, but obviously that kind of process of fossilization that I was talking about before. Texture and form of the bone include the conditions of work, condition of travel, injury, etc., nutrition, and all sort of things that are folded also into a kind of or could be read as the discourse of rights. So in a sense, the skeleton is not only photographed, but is seen, and perhaps I'm kind of preempting one of your responses, Hito, in referring to one thing that we discussed today. The skeleton is itself a kind of a photograph, right? On which the process of life is registered against a completely mutating, constantly mutating film, right? Which is the body itself. So it's something that also is incredibly important in the whole gesture of Clyde Snow, here presenting a skull in the trial of the junta, is that he presents human remains not as evidence, right? Evidence refers to the realm of objects. Witnesses refer to the realm of subjects. But kind of his practice start blurring those domains, right? He talks or he refers to those skeletons as witnesses. And I will return to that, what is happening exactly with that. In fact, Snow and other grave diggers literally mark a shift in emphasis in human rights investigation from the living to the dead, from the whole discourse of memory and trauma, i.e. the whole problem of testimony, with its inconsistencies, contradictions, in which supposedly trauma is registered, to empirical science. From a form of concentration on subject, that is people, to a concentrate on things which are kind of quasi-object, quasi-subject-like, the skulls of the dead. And obviously kind of the shift from testimony to forensic is a shift from the kind of locus, the nomos of the camp, to that of the mass grave. Because human remains are never simply objects. In those, in all sorts of relation to them, in kind of our treatment of them, is registered that kind of ambiguity. In a history of osteobiography, in the service of war crime investigation, there is a scene that is rarely discussed, right? I was saying that that discourse kind of refers to the trial of the Argentine junta as its starting point. However, it has merited 3 chapters in a book by Christopher Joyce and Eric Stover called Witnesses from the Grave, a book which is more or less about this man, about Clyde Snow. The crucial hinge in the book are 3 chapters in the middle dealing with the exhumation and the identification of the remain of a skeleton suspected to be that of Joseph Mengele in Brazil in 1985. It is around this specific investigation that the new science of forensic identification of human remains and the beginning of its application further from there starts, right? So the problem of the exhumation of Mengele, in fact, lead to the development of the methodologies of osteobiography in that form. So the background, I think it must be known. In the middle of the 80s, there was a last-ditch effort to find the remaining Nazi war criminals. It was also a time when kind of the whole discourse of memory, history, and trauma was very present in politics and culture, and they needed a last trial, the last possibility to bring in the survivors to register their testimony, as in the Eichmann trial, and you can see it in Eyal Weizman's film. So the kind of the finding of that skeleton, and it was in fact the budgets for Nazi hunting increased tremendously at the end of the 80s. Wiesenthal started investing money on that. American district attorneys started mobilizing teams that were kind of going through South America, trying to find, and at the top of the list was always Mengele to be brought. The Israelis, the Germans themselves. They find a correspondence in a small town in Bayern called Günzburg that pointed to that grave in a very small, very provincial suburb of Sao Paulo called Embu des Artes, right? They go into this grave site, they take out a skeleton. The Brazilian police kind of take the Mengele, or that skull, shows it to the cameras as the kind of trophy of finding Mengele, much to the chagrin of all those others who wanted to conduct a trial at the time. So the impossibility of the trial of Mengele, in fact, leads to that kind of shift in war crime investigation, right? Because what begins is a kind of a quasi-trial, a kind of a peer review process of the top forensic investigators, pathologists, who are invited from Germany, from Israel, from the United States, from Argentina, Brazil, etc., who are standing around that gurney in Embu des Artes and start the process of a kind of a peer review, checking each other's work in identifying that skeleton. No skeleton has been looked at in such detail. Every bone of the 300 so was x-rayed from all directions. They are going very, very slowly into the balance of the kind of the increase of probability, which starts by saying that's a skeleton of a male. That's 1 to, what is it now? 3 billion, let's say. Then it is right-handed. Then it is 174 centimeters. Then it is of a person that they could see on the bone has moved from Central Europe to Central America in the 50s, right? So i.e. that moment of migration, and that geography is registered in it, etc., etc., etc. And kind of everything that they find or do not find, and not everything fits into that, because in fact that kind of osteobiography means that they construct a timeline of the life of Mengele as they know it, and compare it against all the cracks and all the specificities within the bones themselves. There's some things that they could not find. There's certain illnesses that they could not find registered in it. So everything within that kind of trial of the material bones is either reducing or increasing that balance of probability. Of course, the pressure of having a trial is incredibly kind of strong, and they're being just absolutely careful about it. Again, the kind of question that becomes relevant is not how that person has died, but who is it, right? How to kind of to compare that moment. So they find this is kind of all sort of clues that increase or decrease the balance of probability. Of course, as you know, as any empirical science, forensic anthropologists present their find as a kind of in a probabilistic mode. No, so they were getting into the higher 80s percent, but that was obviously not enough for anyone there. There's also an incredible, as Tom and I kind of reconstructing the process that went around that skeleton. There's a certain Israeli, a certain Menachem Rusek, that comes in and out of the room, and kind of his only task in that investigation is to roll his eyes, no, and basically kind of like seed that sort of sense of doubt. What they needed for conviction was an image that was in excess of the scientific procedure, right? So they go and they present their finding within what is called within reasonable scientific certainty, right? You do not close a file on somebody like Mengele on that balance of probability. They needed an image. Forensics, of course, is not about the science, but about science as a means for conviction. The conviction of people that are not scientists, judge or jury, when the trial, or sometimes the public or the media, or sometimes the balance of probability needs to increase when you're speaking to survivors. It was Richard Helmer, a German pathologist and a photographer, that provided the necessary image leading to the conclusion of this investigation. Sorry, this is the image. Okay. The identification was based on the development of a photographic technique that he himself pioneered, but the budget allowed for that particular identification allowed him to perfect. And that is a photographic technique that was based on the following principle. Helmer was studying, as a kind of almost phrenological fashion, hundreds of skulls in his laboratory. What he was looking for was the average distance between the skin and the bone, right, which is different in every person, and averaging it out. He took the Embu skull, the Mengele skull around which this whole process begins, and he starts using it like a cushion. Is that in focus? like a kind of like a pin cushion, right? Where the white dot on the end of the pin marks the location of the skin. Then he was taking 2 video cameras. One was continuously shooting the skull itself that was placed on a kind of pedestal, and the other shooting a photograph or a series of photographs from Mengele's life. They were feeding into a single monitor that was moving back and forth between the two in order to create an illusion of kind of transparency or a kind of division of the screen into 2 as kind of 80s technology of video would allow. But that image, the eruption of that image into the discourse, allowed the presentation and the conclusion of the investigation, right? You see that kind of all sort of ways by which the camera actually kind of operate. Of course, when the investigation was concluded, the skeleton remained in the morgue in Embu des Artes, being taken in and out. The drawer was opened and closed whenever new technology existed to undertake further investigations. It was the kind of emergence of DNA in 1982 that completely put an end to that process of osteobiography. It became a kind of an art that developed between the exhumation of Mengele, and 1982, when DNA was cheap enough to undertake, when that was. But still, I find in that kind of an interesting moment. So 2 points I want to say before continuing further. One, that I find interesting, that it was the skull of the phrenologist. As you know, Mengele himself has written his PhD on phrenology, that is a kind of a study of a skull in relation to race and criminal tendencies, that became one of the most important scientific and epistemic problems at the end of the 20th century. 2 is that, and that's something that I meant, that the culture of the witness had obsessed the last third of the 20th century, something that Fellman and Laub, at the time, at exactly the same year of Mengele exhumation in 85, called that era the era of testimony, right, in relation to Lanzmann's movie, Shoah, is kind of turning around the problem of the other Nazi criminal. No? Mengele, if Eichmann kind of bring in the sort of the culture of testimony where witnesses enter the court, in kind of around the problem of Mengele's skull, the methodologies of exhumations are undertaken. So there's something like a hinge here in that particular skull bone. Now, like testimony, forensics has political, ethic, and aesthetic manifestation that need to be unpacked, right? So if the error of the witness is not simply a kind of an epistemic problem, but a problem of the ethic of compassion, of identification, of all sort of human rights principles that are developed around human rights organizations regard testimony completely in excess of its epistemic value. No, it is not about simply tell us what has happened. The very fact that testimony is possible is seen as a kind of part of the ideology of human rights, of taking the side of the individual against the totalitarian state. The problem of of forensics and the aesthetics and politics that relate to it start having its own kind of ripple effect within society. Now, this is the quote from Snow. Snow was saying, "Bones make great witnesses. They speak softly, but they never forget and they never lie." So the skull is not only a witness, it's a witness that never lies. It's a witness that is incapable of lying. It's capable only of telling the truth, supposedly fossilized into its form. But there is a kind of a strange reflection on truth and lie in here, no? I mean, if there is speech, we would say, what is speech if not a presentation of reality from one's own interest, the creation of narrative, right? What is the speech that could not lie? So there is a possibility. Death is not the end of speech, according to the sentence, or following that sentence. But when the bone does speak, it does not lie. So that somehow the difference between subjects, people, and objects is that only the latter are capable of lying. In this sense, lie is a certain form of construction. And I think we want to say in this project something like the opposite, and look at the incredible arduous labor of the construction of truth through the notion of forensics. A construction that requires all sort of combined mechanism of science, rhetorics, and theatrics, the mobilization of images and their presentation, and how to think those within a particular context. And a certain, obviously, passion for the object, a kind of a desire diving into the objectivity of things that becomes a certain methodological fetishism that is incredibly important. No? So fetish here is not a kind of obfuscating veil to hiding the true relation of production that goes into the making of things, but the necessary condition to kind of to turn that object into a certain quasi-subject. So I don't know, do I still have time? Because I still have 5 minutes. Oh, that's a miracle. 5, yeah. Guatemala, one of the other kind of sites of exhumation in South America, it was undertaken by the Argentine, or led initially by the Argentine exhumation team, trained by Snow, as while he was kind of in Brazil, he was going to Argentina, etc. What is interesting about forensics as a kind of a concept that needs to be taken outside of its exclusive legal meaning and placed again into kind of its rhetorical and aesthetic one. I mean, in fact, out of the 3 kind of modes of rhetoric, forensics being the one in which includes the possibility of objects to speak to a forum. Forensic comes from forum and demand a kind of possibility for things to speak, but of course they do not. So then we need a translator. There is a translator that stands kind of between the object and the forum as it is communicated, as thing is communicated. And that form of translation is always called a different thing. It could be called ventriloquizing, as in, you know, the translator being today the expert scientist, speaks on behalf of the object, puts words in its mouth, so to say, while on the other hand, it could be seen as possession, right? That translator is possessed by the object or by the dead. And I think that those 2 rhetorical tropes are continuously kind of employed in relation to that form. So you're having this kind of photograph of a project that in fact we are currently about to undertake or to participate in joining the Guatemala forensic team that is concerned with the 1980s massacres, genocides in Guatemala by the Guatemalan military, sponsored by or trained by Americans at the time. Kind of an incredible history of different groups that were kind of inhabiting those jungles, from the indigenous Mayans, Cubans, and all sort of Marxists of sorts that kind of were forming the sort of resistance to the government. And you know, that here you see that kind of forensic moment as sort of like quasi-religious scientific moment of creating a forum around those things that are presented. I wanted to end with a kind of almost ridiculous afterthought and kind of try to, rather than work it out, kind of throw something forward in terms of the more contemporary uses of skull shape in relation to science. And that is in relation to a film that I have done with Jane and Louise Wilson and Shimon Bazar, who are not here, on the investigation of the Dubai assassination, the Israelis attributed to the Mossad the killing of Mahmoud al-Mabhouh in January 2009. The way in which that was resolved, let's say, or that the reconstruction has been made, and you all know that incredible film that has been made by of CCTV cameras of all sort of interiors in Dubai as they move from one interior to the other, from the airport lounge to the hotel lobby to another shopping mall, etc. Only interior shots have been pasted together, in fact, by a kind of a face recognition software that is based on skull foam, right? So all ways of camouflaging face recognition, right? So there is the technologies of trying to confuse. These are all forms of camouflage that perhaps will not work on the human eye, but are there to confuse the algorithm that connects skull shape to a particular individual, and then from that individual start building extensive networks of operation. Where am I? It's the skulls. Yeah. So that particular film was in fact trying to kind of paste together that narrative, and we were kind of trying to sort of recreate that story. But I think in that form of face recognition software, certain form of relation of skull shape to a particular crime and its reconstruction, there is something of what was lost with the kind of, the stopping of the the formal analysis of bone shapes that was interrupted in 1992. Thank you for listening.